You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. At the tail end of the pandemic, I lived in China for 5 months, where I had a front row seat for Shanghai's tight zero COVID restrictions.
It is hard to imagine, but for the last year and a half or so, as much of the world was grappling with how to contain COVID without locking society down completely, China was locking down completely.
After the original strain of the virus ripped through Wuhan at the end of 2019, the national government adopted one of the world's strictest approaches to tackling the pandemic. Until recently, this strategy...
In October, China had its 20th Communist Party Congress, a major meeting that secured Xi Jinping's third term as president and cemented his place as the country's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong.
分裂活动和外部势力干涉台湾事务的严重挑衅.
Then, just a few months later, I witnessed the unprecedented challenge that came from his own people, a nationwide backlash to COVID lockdown.
In Shanghai, they chant for freedom, democracy, and end to COVID lockdowns.
In one of the largest demonstrations of public dissent in recent history, thousands of Chinese filled the streets to protest Beijing's strict quarantine and testing mandate. And suddenly, Xi's government reversed course, and in a surprising move, he acknowledged protesters and relaxed the country's COVID policy.
In his New Year video address, President Xi Jinping admitted that China's COVID surge had been fierce and fast.
爆发得很猛.
That's no understatement. A top Chinese...
And for a time, the disease spread like wildfire through the world's largest population. Last year, I spoke with Sue-Lin Wong over Zoom livestream to discuss the dramatic unfolding events in China and China's future under Xi, the man behind her story. Sue-Lin is a correspondent for The Economist and host of The Prince, an 8-part podcast about China's leader Xi Jinping, widely hailed as one of 2022's best podcast series. Sue-Lin covered China for 8 years for The Economist, The Financial Times, and Reuters. We caught up with her just as she began a new role covering Southeast Asia. You've said the future of China's 1.4 billion people and maybe world peace hinges on the mind of one man. Well, that's a lot to hinge on one man. You've called him the most powerful man in the world. Why does Xi Jinping wear those titles?
So for many decades, China was ruled with cautious and collective leadership by the Chinese Communist Party. But over the last 10 years, we've seen Xi Jinping really consolidate his power and become a strong man who no one really is willing to challenge in China and in the Chinese Communist Party, which is the largest political organization in the world with many more members than the population of Germany. And we just saw, as you mentioned, this very important political meeting late in 2022, where Xi Jinping has decided to stay on beyond the usual 10-year limit that Chinese leaders have. And it doesn't really look like he's named a successor. It looks like he's surrounded himself by extreme loyalists who are not going to challenge him. And it looks like he could remain in power for a very long time as China grows stronger and stronger, becomes much more aggressive on the world stage, and as the Chinese Communist Party domestically has really ramped up ideology and has sort of made the party central to so much life in China in a way that it wasn't in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. So what we're seeing is a real shift right now. And we've seen it since Xi Jinping seized power, and we can expect that to continue into the future. And so for all these reasons, Xi Jinping has so reshaped China. He's now trying to reshape the world. In order for us to better understand China, we have to better understand the Chinese Communist Party and who Xi Jinping is, because that's all going to impact how China interacts with the world.
Xi Jinping is centering power around himself and the person of himself, enshrining, well, I'll have you tell us, what is Xi Jinping thought?
Ooh, well, in a way, it is anything and everything that bolsters Xi Jinping, bolsters the Chinese Communist Party. So there's all kinds of Xi Jinping thought, Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy, on economic growth, on the environment. And what we're seeing increasingly is this personality cult around Xi Jinping that's being created, and that has all kinds of very dangerous implications that we're already seeing play out in China. So, for example, the people around him are becoming much less likely to challenge him or to raise questions about policy until he himself has a change of mind. And what happened with China's COVID policy, which I'm sure we'll get into, is an example of this, where, there were many, many health experts within the Chinese bureaucracy, technocrats who had spent their whole careers studying public health. And, they would have known that what was happening in China with zero COVID, especially in 2022, was not good policy. But everyone was so focused on the big 20, as you say, this big political meeting, that they just had to get through that. Xi Jinping further consolidated his power there. And then it seems like he changed his mind about China's COVID policy for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that China had lost control and Omicron had just spread so rapidly within the country. And it was only then that we saw a policy shift. And so I think increasingly, as Xi Jinping becomes more powerful, we're going to see policy that comes from him and that technocrats and party officials around him sort of scramble to make policy about. And that's very, very dangerous for China. And the other thing I would add is people are going to become much more cautious about what they tell him. So I'm very worried about how much good quality information is getting to Xi Jinping now, as there is so much fear within the system, and it's become very clear that the people who get promoted are Xi Jinping loyalists who he maybe has known for decades, since he was a young party official in the provinces.
I was in a bookstore in that forest of high-rises in the relatively new commercial district across the river, Lujiazui, and it was fascinating to see the pile of books by Xi Jinping meant to sort of codify his thinking on various issues. 5 volumes in multiple languages. And given what you just said about cultivating hangers-on who are waiting to see what he thinks and waiting for signals about how to proceed, they're probably sifting through those books and publications like it to figure out how to please the boss. If this philosophy, the governing philosophy of the man that you covered in your podcast series, is going to be the law in China, I guess if you see yourself as a young man on the way up, you want to know some chewy quotes from those books. You want to know what those quotes represent so you can turn it into policy and please the guy at the top of the food chain, no?
That's exactly right. And the thing I would add to that is it's not just the people at the very top of the Communist Party that have to pore over these incredibly thick books that you saw in the Lujiazui bookshop. It's actually that Xi Jinping thought and party ideology have permeated across Chinese society in a way that is a distinct shift. So now if you're a primary school kid, in your textbooks, there's Xi Jinping thought. If you work at a tech company or some kind of, ostensibly private business, you will increasingly have to study Xi Jinping thought, party ideology in your lunch breaks, at party cell meetings, if you're a party member. And so that is really a fundamental shift. And you can see the party becoming much more present in people's lives in all kinds of ways.
China has, interestingly, been in the news quite a bit. It was announced that there was the first decline in the population in 60 years since an era of episodic famine in the country. It was announced that economic growth had missed its targets for the first time in a long time. And the country officially conceded and this seemed to me to be really big, that tens of millions of people have been infected with COVID and tens of thousands have died. And we have to remember that at the end of 2022, the official number of dead in China from COVID-19 was still less than 6,000 people, which is not to say that less than 6,000 people had actually died, but that was the official number that the Chinese were dealing with. And the about-face in COVID policy was stunning in its speed, in its consequence, and also coming right after the party conference where it was reiterated, we are sticking with zero COVID. We're not changing course. We're not lowering restrictions. When that was announced at the end of the party conference, the market dropped sharply because people had been hoping for better news on that front. And the man who was the architect of the lockdown in the spring in Shanghai, which lasted for 2 whole months, and it was a miserable time in the city, was promoted to the inner circle. So the signals were 2023 is going to be just like 2022. And then suddenly all the wraps came off in the space of a few weeks. Is Xi Jinping the kind of guy who changes his mind? Was there some careful thinking about how to insulate him from the fallout in these changes in decision-making?
Yeah, they're two great questions. I mean, clearly Xi Jinping is the kind of guy who changes his mind because what we've seen is, as you said, just a radical shift in China's COVID policy. So, until November 2022, there was this zero COVID policy in China that was utterly different from policies across the rest of the world as the world started to learn to live with COVID and to sort of move on from the pandemic. Whereas China there were cities that remained in lockdown, there was mass testing that was causing local governments to turn bankrupt. People couldn't get passports, they couldn't leave China. It was very difficult to even travel around China itself. I mean, I would love to hear more about your experiences in China, Ray. I haven't been there since early COVID, but I know you were there recently. So, that was the situation until November 22. And then suddenly we saw a radical shift and zero COVID policy was abandoned. I think what's important to note here is that there has been a somewhat simplistic narrative that there were these student protests, which were genuinely extraordinary. The students were incredibly courageous. But, there is this narrative that was what caused the shift. And, Xi Jinping saw the student protests and decided we have to end zero COVID. I actually think it's much more complicated than that. And I think, there were scientific considerations. So it was clear that the party had lost control of COVID and it was running rampant throughout the country. And, by November, Xi Jinping and top officials were faced with this question of, do we go back into the type of Shanghai lockdown that we saw earlier in 2022, where one of the world's biggest financial centers was locked down for weeks on end, but have that across the whole country? Or do we abandon zero COVID? And coupled with that was, very, very sluggish economic growth, as you referenced, and this growing sense of frustration across the country, not just with the student protests, but with labor protests at, iPhone factories in southern China, where there's huge manufacturing hubs, and also just, middle-class Chinese who were fed up across the country at all these regulations. And so I think it was a combination of all those things that led to the end of zero COVID. But Ray, I'm very curious, what was your experience around that time?
So I walked out my front door and was in a crowd of tens of thousands of people chanting for Xi Jinping to resign, which was stunning to hear, to end the restrictions, chanting freedom, singing the national anthem, saying we want to be free. It was a remarkable thing. And then my testing center closed down. So it got harder for me to keep my health code up to date. But it was a fascinating thing to be able to watch.
That's something that we haven't seen in China since the protests in Tiananmen Square in 1989. It was absolutely extraordinary. I was just glued to my computer and social media, seeing what was coming out. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was just really, really impressive what these protesters did, given the costs. And this was something I covered a lot in my podcast, The Prince, because of the propaganda machine, the censorship machine, the surveillance state, the risks of protesting against the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping are so high. Unfortunately, though, it seems like many of the protesters are now in detention, have been disappeared. The party has this playbook, and that's exactly, we're sort of seeing it play out once again. I think there's also a lot of resignation and fatalism, especially in the countryside, because what are you going to do? There's no elections. You can't vote Xi Jinping out. Sort of protesting and getting angry is not going to do anything. It's not going to improve your quality of life.
But I wonder about just that point, because yes, there are no elections. Yes, there's no mechanism for registering your unhappiness with the system as it is. But people who work in China as reporters, people who have studied it as scholars, have told me for a long time that there is an unofficial mechanism, that the government still does not only want, but need the approval of the people of the country, even if there are no elections, that they have made a kind of deal, a social compact, and if they can't deliver more affluence and can't deliver health and security, those are breaches of that contract. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is part of it, but I think the other really important aspect is the ability of people to organize. And that was partially why those protests in late 2022 were so extraordinary, because we saw them break out in so many cities across the country. Usually what you see is a discrete labor protest or a discrete protest against, environmental degradation in a single place. I think what the party really fears is protests being linked up across the country in a way that it could threaten the party existentially. And I just don't think we have any evidence that that is possible in Xi Jinping's China, given the surveillance state, given censorship, given propaganda.
You take us in the series through China's path over the last several decades and tell China's modern story through the life of Xi Jinping. It occurs to me that there's been a change. The China that I visited earlier in this century, that was glad to have foreign visitors, glad to have foreign businesses open, have foreign influences, as a show of China joining a cosmopolitan world, is not that important anymore. That Xi Jinping's theory of the case, if you will, might be very different from Deng Xiaoping's. That the large number of foreigners who were living and working in China who are leaving is not something that would worry him particularly. That his idea about China is of a country that is so self-sufficient and self-confident that it no longer needs or wants foreigners present, doing business, making contacts, that Chinese cities don't have to be a window to the world.
I think that's completely right. And I think there are many, many people of my generation who were hoping that China would become more and more open and more free, and that has not happened at all. Another data point in terms of, the direction China has gone in is just all the young Chinese people I know who are trying to leave, not for a holiday, but, permanently trying to migrate. There's this whole phenomenon called runxue, so the study of running. I'm not sure if any of your students at NYU Shanghai have shared with you about their own perspectives on this. But, the fact you have a whole generation of sort of the Chinese elite who are incredibly unhappy with the current situation, but realize there's nothing they can say or do domestically. And so you either sort of stay quiet, or you try and find a way to leave, I think is very, very telling about the current state of China under Xi Jinping.
I was talking to two young men at the demonstration, both around 20 years old, both university students. One was able to leave the country. He has contacts and relatives and a sort of paper trail that will allow him to get into Canada. And he said, I think I'm going. This last year was so bad that even when earlier I had decided to stick it out, I'm going to go. To my other side was a young man, just as bright, just as capable, just as ambitious as his peer, but had no way to get out of the country. And you could hear the distress as he talked about the situation where he perceived the country as closing up, where he perceived the horizons as narrowing, but also knew that he had very little option for either changing it or changing his own circumstances. Those two young men are looking at the same set of circumstances in two very different ways.
Yeah, that's right. And the reality is the majority of Chinese people are going to stay in China. It's not like the majority will have the opportunity or the ability or the desire to leave. But it's definitely a phenomenon we're seeing right now. The other point I would want to add to what you're saying about, China's approach to the world now is that it has become very clear that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party genuinely believes that the West wants to keep China down and the West wants to slow its economy down and really crush it. And so what we're seeing is this shift towards this emphasis on self-sufficiency in China. And that is reshaping the country in all kinds of ways, including what you're saying about how increasingly jobs done by foreigners or sort of foreign business is not nearly as welcome as it used to be. And there is more and more of a shift towards prioritizing Chinese businesses as China becomes more and more closed.
Is that the influence of Xi Jinping? Does that represent his way of thinking about the country as he takes it in very different directions from previous leaders since the reopening?
I would first caveat by saying that it's so hard for us to know what goes on in Xi Jinping's mind. So much of elite Chinese politics is a black box, and that was one of the reasons Making the Prince was so difficult. But if I had to guess, I would say yes. And, why do I say that? If you read Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy, if you look at the type of message that's being sent from the top of the party to Chinese diplomats around the world, there is more and more of an emphasis on China being assertive, aggressive, the rise of wolf warrior diplomacy. And that has all happened as Xi Jinping has been the leader of China.
Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan while I was living in Shanghai, and the rage coming from government circles was fascinating. It was almost as if they didn't remember that Nancy Pelosi had been a very severe critic of China for decades, not just a Johnny-come-lately to the issue, but some people said to me, well, why doesn't Joe Biden tell her that she can't go? And I had to sort of give them a quick lesson in American constitutional organization that really Joe Biden can't tell her he can't go. And she was doing something both cagey and risky, I guess, but it brought China to the fore right before the Party Congress, which ruffled a lot of feathers in China, I can assure you. But I'm interested in the possible ramifications for the thinking about Taiwan that emanate from the invasion of Ukraine. 2022 began with Vladimir Putin traveling to Beijing for the Olympics, standing shoulder to shoulder, one of the few world leaders to visit China during that period, and for the two leaders of these giant countries to declare their support for each other, their mutual interests in a multipolar world, and so on. And then just a matter of a few weeks later comes this invasion, which, by many accounts, the Chinese were blindsided by. They didn't think he was actually going to go through with it. There's been a lot of speculation about what it means to China, both that it's gone badly and that Xi Jinping has been so forthright in his support for the Putin government in Moscow.
Yeah, I think what's important to remember is China is about China. And so we're seeing, China try to take advantage of the situation as much as possible, buying as much cheap gas from Russia as it can. It's very much about America and the fact that China sees America as its enemy. And so there was some speculation about whether China was going to come out and condemn Russia and Ukraine. But it's important to remember that China views all of this from its own perspective, what is in its own national interests. And it's in its interests for America and its allies to carry out this long, extended proxy war. And, I think China is hoping that Europe will split from America as energy prices rise in Europe, as the cost of living increases in Europe. So it's all very much about, what would help China, what is in its own national interests.
That's Sue-Lin Wong of The Economist. Please look out for her podcast series, The Prince, telling the story of China's big leader, Xi Jinping. Thanks so much, Sue-Lin. It's been a pleasure to look back and look ahead with you.
Thanks so much for having me, Ray. It was great chatting.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, why President Xi is turning toward Europe and how China's relationship with Russia may jeopardize Western support. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Back in 2013, President Xi Jinping was riding high. China was experiencing steady economic growth. Rural villagers were rapidly entering the middle class, and the leader had a bold vision for a new Silk Road. The Belt and Road Initiative was an ambitious investment linking East Asia and Europe through infrastructure projects. Some analysts were skeptical and called the initiative audacious, while others feared it signaled the inevitability of China's rising power. But a decade later, the costs of the project have skyrocketed, leaving some nations in substantial debt to China. International opposition has grown so loud, many wonder if Xi made a bad bet, and some countries are wondering if the influence and perceived dominance of China is already waning. In early May, President Xi traveled to Europe for the first time since 2019, in the days before the COVID-19 pandemic. And he met with European leaders, most notably French President Emmanuel Macron. The two leaders met just a year ago on Xi's turf in China, but the threat of a looming trade war with the European Union and China's persistent ties to a belligerent Russia gave Xi's recent trip a lot different tenor. What were the stakes of Xi's European visit, and why is Beijing opening itself up to the West? Christina Yu is a reporter and staff writer at Foreign Policy. She covers global current events and recently wrote about President Xi's visit to Europe. Christina, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much for having me, Ray. It's great to be here.
Well, during the pandemic, there was a lot less globetrotting from the leaders of the smallest to the biggest nations. Was Xi Jinping even more confined than most?
I think with China's zero COVID policy, China, I'd say, took a more strict policy when it came to travel, when it came to people coming in than most other countries. And I'd say that definitely affected Xi Jinping in travel. He used to visit Europe a lot more often than he did now. And that's shown with this trip. This is his first trip in 5 years to Europe and makes it kind of a very high stakes trip and a very big deal.
So why this itinerary? He went some places and not others. And why now? Was it occasioned by any particular one event or other?
So this is really a damage control mission that he's on right now. This is, as we've mentioned, his first trip in more than half a decade, and so much has changed since the last time that he was there. Back then, it was, COVID-19 had yet to hit. Russia had yet to launch its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and Chinese EVs had not yet flooded European markets, which has been a major kind of trade flashpoint between the two. And in a sign back then of how China was seen much more as an economic opportunity, when he was last in Europe, Italy became the first G7 country to join Xi's flagship foreign policy program, the Belt and Road Initiative. Fast forward 5 years, and that has all changed now. Italy has left the BRI in a sign of how attitudes have shifted and how much more intent Europe is now on de-risking ties with China. And relations have worsened since over trade, over green technology, and especially over China's ties with Russia in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine. We've seen that the EU, I think, has launched a number of kind of subsidy probes into China's exports of green technology. And Europe has really hardened its stance a lot. And this is something that Xi is going to try and kind of mend ties over. And if there was a rift before, and there definitely, it was widening, I'd say, he's going to try and do some damage control there.
You've touched on it briefly. Has there been an overall kind of change in tone, not only in Europe, but in a lot of other places, flirting with economic nationalism, grumbling about imports, talking about instituting national policies that favor domestic industries? Is this a particular concern to China among all the things it's got on its plate?
Absolutely. I say that it's a very big concern. And, Xi has brought up how trade ties are a very big deal to him already. We've seen that from his talks with Macron. And we're not just seeing it in Europe either. I'd say that the U.S. is probably one of the biggest leaders in that. The U.S., compared to Europe especially, has taken a very hawkish tone towards China, and it's been trying to get Europe on board. Europe has been hardening its stance, and it's not quite there on the same page as the U.S., but the U.S. definitely wants Europe to be on the same page with it there.
Well, is Xi looking to pick off strays from the herd, looking for leaders in Europe who might want to, let's say, take a different road from the United States and show their independence on this particular set of issues?
Absolutely. And we're seeing that in the countries that he's visiting here. He's stopping in France first, and then he's going to Serbia and Hungary. These are three countries that, compared to many of the other countries in Europe, are, I'd definitely say, the most friendly to China. It's very strategic in timing as well. This year marks the 60th anniversary of China's diplomatic ties with France. It marks the 75th anniversary of China's ties with Hungary. And with Serbia, I believe that he stopped in Belgrade around the 25th anniversary of the U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in the city, which the U.S. has said was accidental, but, remains a very kind of sore point between China and the U.S. So it's very symbolic in nature.
Certainly one of the low points in the modern U.S.-China bilateral. I mean, nobody thought, certainly in Washington, that it was done on purpose. The United States said it was trying to hit a Serbian arms production administration target on the same block, on the same street a few blocks away. But boy, oh boy, it was a terrible time. A lot of leaders in recent bilaterals with China, face-to-face, virtual, with the top guy, Xi, and with senior Chinese officials, have brought up how much Chinese people save. Why does Janet Yellen? Why does Emmanuel Macron? Why does Rishi Sunak care about how much an office worker in Nanjing saves or spends?
I think the kind of main concern here is that China has, I guess, been flooding other markets, right? There's been a lot of concern about what U.S. officials and European officials say is very kind of unfair trade practices. And I think that's the main sort of tension here, that China, because of overcapacity issues, is kind of shipping out a lot of exports when it comes to steel or other kind of green technology exports that are very cheap and that make it very difficult for domestic producers to compete. And I think that remains a major issue in relations and will continue to dominate conversations during this trip.
When you look at the world's biggest economies, it is true that domestic consumption is a smaller percentage of Chinese GDP than any of the other big economies. Chinese are still socking away a lot of money in the bank, not spending on themselves. When you hear Janet Yellen sort of nudging Chinese leaders to make Chinese spend more, it's an interesting economic argument. They have always saved more. A lot of countries save more than Westerners do. But here, I guess, when you're talking about 1/6 of the human race, cumulatively, it's a lot of people socking away a lot of money and not buying the things that other countries make.
Right. Yeah, no, and it remains a huge point of contention. And I'm not sure exactly how much of that will be, I guess, relieved throughout this trip. I know that they have both brought it up, and it remains one of Europe's kind of main priorities during this trip. But yeah, huge issue and will continue to be a very contentious issue.
The Chinese leader, as we've mentioned, comes to Europe at a particularly complicated time. The Gaza war, the Ukraine war, economic question marks over the stability of Chinese growth. For a long time, China sort of floated serenely above these conflicts, didn't fully punch its weight on the world stage as the home of 1/6 of humanity. Is what a Chinese leader visit means different now in 2024? Do they have a lot more heft when they visit a foreign capital?
I think China absolutely has significant heft when it visits a foreign capital, but I think that its position on these wars, at least in talks, Xi tries to frame itself as a peacemaker and as someone that's not really involved. And we've seen that with Ukraine and with Russia, even though China has kind of deepened its economic ties with Russia in the wake of the war. It maintains, I think, even just this last talk with Macron, that China is trying to be impartial and is trying to be a peacemaker in the war. And we've also seen that with Gaza. China has been trying to kind of stay on the sidelines and also portray itself as a power broker, but not one that really is getting too involved. And that is something that has frustrated Europe. And that is something that continues to frustrate the US with Gaza. And as we saw, the Houthi attacks in Iran, and I think China does have more kind of economic heft now, but when it comes to these major wars, it's trying, at least on paper, to not say it's too involved.
Is that being met with skepticism, China's assertion that it's not really involved, for instance, in supplying Russia? Or is that met with a certain amount of eye-rolling when China says it?
I think that China's kind of both defensive and economic support of Russia has totally driven a rift in China's relationship with Europe, no matter how much China says. And again, it said this time that, it's going to refrain from, I think, sending arms to Russia, but it's made that commitment before, and I'm not sure how convincing it is now.
Does it look like the Europeans are going to get any kind of real reassurance from China that it's not helping further Russia's war aims? I mean, it's stepped up and become a major importer of Russian energy supplies. It's tried to fill in the vacuum left by Europe's departure from Russia's list of customers. It's been a pretty stalwart friend. Is Emmanuel Macron going to get any satisfaction from what he hears from China?
It's a great question. What we've seen so far is that China and Macron together have called for what they say is an Olympic truce, or effectively a truce in Ukraine and in other conflicts when the Paris Olympic Games begin, which runs from July to August, I believe. China, as we've mentioned, also kind of again made a commitment where it said that it will not sell arms to Moscow and it will control strictly the exports of dual-use goods, which, as we mentioned, it has also said before. And when it comes to Russia, China has also said that, and EU officials have said that China played an important role in de-escalating Russia's nuclear threats. And those are, I think, the three main examples that we've seen come out of this on how China is trying to kind of make nice when it comes to Russia's war in Ukraine, but there are no commitments, and I don't expect to see any commitments where it's stopping purchases of Russian oil or anything like that.
Another flashpoint that's divided the world community is the fighting in Gaza. Does China have any history in this part of the world? Is it involved diplomatically in what's going on in the Middle East right now?
China would like to portray itself as a regional power broker, and it releases a lot of statements to that extent, but it has been very careful to stay on the sidelines in Gaza and Israel, and it doesn't want to tie itself up in this conflict. That's pretty strategic. We've seen that Washington has kind of faced a lot of pushback from around the world over its support of Israel, especially as we see more about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And China has really been using that opportunity to kind of align itself more with members of the so-called global South who have very sharply diverged from Washington's position and have been pretty outraged over Israel's actions there. It wants to see this wider chasm open up between Washington's positions and these other countries, many of whom, share deep economic ties with China or who are a part of China's Belt and Road Initiative.
There was a recent flash of hostilities between Israel and Iran. Has Beijing been close to Tehran? Did China unwittingly end up watching itself kind of pulled into this thing when it didn't want to be?
China has been very close to Tehran. China has long been Iran's biggest trade partners, especially when it comes to the sale of oil. And we've seen a lot of pressure, especially from U.S. officials, for China to use that economic leverage to rein in Tehran. We especially saw that, during the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. But it could be more complicated than that. First, China would never step in. It is not in its political interest. It doesn't want to be seen as bowing to pressure from the U.S. But also, even if it did want to step in and rein in Tehran, it's not totally clear exactly how far that leverage would go. For example, most Iranian oil that China purchases is bought by private refineries on the black market and not by state refineries, which makes the trade of that kind of harder to regulate and control from Beijing. And when it comes to investment, which could be another point of leverage that Beijing could use, that has already been a sore point in Tehran's relationship with Beijing because Tehran hasn't really been happy with the scale of Chinese investment already, and it wants more. So China has this leverage and it's been getting this pressure, but even if it did want to use that leverage, which it does not, it's not exactly clear how much it could change things.
I was in China in 2019, and this was pre-pandemic, and China convened a conference of all its partners in the Belt and Road Initiative. It was a grand, splashy, super televisual event. It was run live on television, only this endless speeches by delegations, and it was quite a remarkable event. And it looked like sort of the peak moment of China's arrival on the world stage as a convening power, as a pole that was a different pole of power and influence and economic might from that of the West. And then came 2020 and isolation and a lot of backbiting toward China, suspected as the source of the pandemic. You mentioned that Italy pulled out of Belt and Road. Has China's global influence waned since that kind of mountaintop moment where heads of state flocked from all over the world to get FaceTime with the Chinese leader?
We've seen, when it comes to the Belt and Road specifically, that last year marked the 10th anniversary of the initiative. We've seen that China has been winding it down and that it's been changing kind of in nature, where it used to be about these really big, flashy infrastructure projects, building new highways, building really major ports, for example. It's been shifting in nature to where Beijing is, emphasizing projects that are smaller and beautiful, and their words, not mine, and more kind of green investments or kind of green-focused projects. It's hard to say whether or not China's influence has waned. I think that the picture from the BRI specifically has been mixed, where a lot of the projects there's been a lot of controversies about, bridges collapsing, or there's been the whole issues of these countries being saddled with a lot of debt after the project has been completed. But also, this was kind of a really massive infrastructure program where China has managed to build a lot of ties around the world, and that we're still seeing kind of resonate today in Africa, for example, where we're seeing the U.S. trying to counter China's infrastructure clout, but also political and economic clout that it's built through the BRI with its own kind of answer to the BRI, which is the libido corridor. So I think that the picture was mixed. I think that the BRI in many places was controversial, but also that it did help China build many of these ties, and those are ties that we're now seeing other countries like the United States try and counter and try and build its own of with its own kind of infrastructure programs.
Is there borrower's remorse, full-on borrower's remorse in some places? Are there countries that have really, in addition to Italy, which of course is one of the largest economies in the world, are there less economically vital countries that have had to rethink the nature of its relationship and whether this was a good deal for them or not?
I think a key point that you're nodding to here is that I think one of the tensions of the BRI is that I guess the inherent bargain is in it was that we will be building ties, kind of making friends by lending you money. And then when there were so many issues with countries not being able to pay it back, then that put China in the really uncomfortable position of having to be a debt collector. But how do you collect debt from countries that you wanted to be friends with? That's very difficult and goes against the initial plan. Probably not what China expected, but now it's in this position where it had this plan of making friends and now it's having to break bones, and that's not a fun place to be in. And definitely, if it wanted there to be goodwill, that would definitely erode some of that goodwill.
I wonder if the bloom is off the rose a little bit, that China using economics as an instrument of extending its interests around the world has already seen its peak. That what's complicated about that, what's complicated, messy, and doesn't always pay off about being a world power is now starting to make itself evident. That places that were, I don't want to say supplicants, but let's say much more hospitable toward China's arrival on the world stage are reconsidering because they are finding it's hard to sell their goods there. They salivated over a market of over 1 billion people and then found out they couldn't get their stuff into Chinese ports and onto Chinese shelves. That the flashy promise of these relationships 20 years ago are turning out to be something else. And now China's just another country with interests, with upsides and downsides, and one that you have to be more careful about.
I think that especially in the Europe and in the United States, attitudes towards China are definitely changing. And I think that, if we look back to Xi's ongoing trip in Europe, where China used to be seen more as an economic opportunity, as we saw when Italy, for example, joined the BRI, it is now definitely being viewed a lot more skeptically and a lot more cautiously, and it's being seen more as a challenge and a rival and less of an opportunity. And I think that is changing how all of these countries, and probably many more, are starting to interact with China and how they're navigating relations with China. And I think that will be kind of an issue that Xi will be contending with for many, many years to come.
One product line that China has moved aggressively and decisively into is electric vehicles. And you'll see a BYD badge on the front, but along the back, it says, "Build your dreams." And BYD is heading to Hungary, opening its first factory in the EU. And Hungary hasn't always been seen as the best team player in the Viktor Orban era. Is this being portrayed elsewhere in Europe as kind of an electric vehicle Trojan horse?
Europe is very alarmed by China's exports of EVs and other forms of green technology as well, although EVs, Chinese EV exports to Europe have kind of exploded way more than they have to the US, for example. But this is an issue that has really been alarming European leaders. And I think that is a big part of the reason why we've seen Brussels, specifically in the European Union, take a much harder line and adopt a much tougher posture towards trading with China. And there's the threat of tariffs. We've seen these subsidy probes. It just seems like there has been a kind of a reawakening in Europe and especially in Brussels when it comes to Chinese EVs. And I'm sure that the decision for BYD to kind of set up shop in Hungary is really just kind of intensifying those concerns.
It is fascinating, the reaction to China moving worldwide. When you're in big Chinese cities, it's quieter and easier to breathe on a lot of days because even when you're in heavy traffic, there just isn't all that emission coming out. It's coming out somewhere else because that electricity has to be generated somewhere. But both the United States and Europe have kind of said, well, we can't beat them, so we're just going to keep them out, which is a very passive kind of reaction to an economic and industrial and innovation challenge. Instead of saying, well, if China has stolen a day's march on us, we've got to hurry to catch up. A lot of political leaders, both in Europe and North America, have said, it almost sounds like surrender. We can catch up. So the best thing to do is to just keep them out, which is remarkable.
I cover a lot of critical mineral issues, which have also been another flashpoint between the US and China. And with rare earths, for example, which are these elements that are very powerful and not rare, but they go into clean energy technologies and also advanced weapons systems and, just really high-tech defensive gear. I think this is an issue that's playing out in that arena, especially because China just has this decades-long lead on the US and honestly much of the world when it comes to building out those supply chains and processing and refining systems. And I think the question now is, well, if they have that decades-long lead, how do we get around that? How do we compete with that? It feels like they're very far away and it feels like it is hard to catch up, but we are also seeing movement on that side for the U.S. to also try and carve out new partnerships, for example, with the Libido corridor in Africa for the supply of cobalt and copper. We're seeing other U.S. efforts to build out their own mines and really get going domestically with support from the IRA and other programs. But I think that is kind of one of the existential challenges of the U.S. rivalry with China is that it's not going away, that question of how to get around that. And yeah, I think that it's kind of one of the defining questions, I think, of this rivalry.
Christina Yu is a staff writer at Foreign Policy. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian and Andrew Stelzer in collaboration with the World Affairs Live Programs team. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.